Welcome back once again to another episode of College Football Pros. I am your host, as always, Nicholas Vlinchak, and I'm joined by my man Drew, and we are excited today because we are going to talk Notre Dame football with the Notre Dame beat writer for the South Bend Tribune and the co-host of WSBT's Sports Beat weekday show, Eric Hansen. How are we doing this afternoon?
Doing great. How are you guys doing, Nick and Drew?
I'm good, Nick. How are you today?
I'm pretty excited. Get to talk some Notre Dame football.
It wasn't meant to be a trick question.
I had to think about it. You know, it's been one of those days. I had to get up early to go to a business breakfast and hear a bunch of things that I've known for 4 years. So that's always productive when you start your day off like that. However, I did get some free sticky notes, so there's a plus out of everything, I feel. And, yeah, it's one day closer to the start of the college football season, which I'm sure we can all agree that we're very excited for after the way the year ended last year with Ohio State taking the title. I mean, there's no doubt that there's excitement in the air when it comes to this sport in 2015.
I would agree with you, and I think we've analyzed things to death, and we just want to start to see games to see if we're as smart predicting things as the teams will let us be.
Well, according to everything I've seen, no team from the 2014 college playoff should make it in 2015. I've heard every statistic in the world to suggest there's been no repeat SEC champions in X amount of years, and there's been no team that was ranked number one in the coaches poll that went on to repeat since 2004. You know, every statistic in the world says that we should have a fresh slate in 2015. So I'm inclined to believe that we'll see at least half the teams return for the playoffs in 2015.
Okay, I think that there's going to be some new teams in there. I think Ohio State's going to get in there, and I think the other three are going to be different.
So, if that's a good starting point, where do you see those? Who do you see those three teams being? We can kind of share thoughts right now.
Well, I just had to fill out my AP poll vote, and it doesn't come out until August 23rd, so it must take them a while to be able to count the votes. But I came in with Ohio State at number 1, TCU at number 2, which is fairly common 1 and 2. With number 3, I went Michigan State, also from the Big Ten. And I think Michigan State may beat Ohio State this year, but we'll see. And then number 4, I went with Alabama.
Drew, where are you sitting at?
That's interesting. I'm not going to lie. I think Michigan State is a little bit overhyped coming into the season. Losing Narduzzi to Pitt is a big loss to that defense. I know they have a ton of talent coming back, but with the coaching change, interesting. I mean, I like TCU at 2. That's the consensus number 2. And number 1 is Ohio State. I mean, at Alabama, I almost feel like you have to have an SEC team in there.
I'd agree with that. I'm sitting with my top 2 the same. In a previous, when we first discussed the Big Ten, I talked extensively. I stared at the schedule for about 25 minutes when it came down to the Ohio State-Michigan State game. And for 24 minutes, I had Ohio State as the winner, or I had Michigan State as the winner, and then at the end I said I can't buy it, because every scenario in my head, something had to happen to Ohio State for Michigan State, and I didn't want to play the hypotheticals, but I see them having a good shot. I like USC. I'm really big on USC. And then my number 4, I keep switching through SEC teams, and lately I've been falling at Georgia.
Yeah, I've got them in my top 10 at 8. I like Georgia. I'm just not sure what kind of quarterback play we're going to see from them. But Nick Chubb is really, really good, and there's a lot of good players on that team. So I don't think that's, thinking too far outside the box at all.
I mean, we're sitting 9 and 10 months removed from a point in time when Gurley went down and Chubb came in, and there was a consensus question mark about what was going to potentially happen, and now we're singing the praises of someone who outperformed him, pretty significantly, albeit, Gurley obviously in very short time with the team. But yeah, this rushing attack at Georgia is not skipping a beat.
I would agree with you.
It's a three-headed monster with him, Michelle, and Marshall. I mean, it's who do you
Right.
stop? I mean, that's a plethora of running back talent, and I'm excited for that team. I'm also excited for USC and Cody Kessler. I don't know. I'm high on him and that whole team in general.
My question about USC is with their defense, if they'll be a really good defense, and maybe in Steve Sarkisian's second year they'll be a little bit better, but they lost, obviously a really great defensive lineman. But I like some of their individual parts on defense, including Sua Cravens. I think he's really good.
That's a tough conference out there, and it could go a number of different ways. I'm also fairly high on the Stanford team coming out this year. I'm really unsure about Oregon, and it only gets more and more confusing with each passing day. Tyner goes down with the shoulder injury. It looks like he's going to be gone for the year. No idea if Vernon Adams is going to be in the conversation whatsoever. If he doesn't pass this test on Thursday, it looks like he's not going to play. So there's a lot of question marks in that program.
I would agree with you. And you know what? Again, their defense wasn't particularly good last year, and they had a dynamic player that kind of transcended what was going on defense. They were really bad on third down. And they're going to need a really dynamic player at quarterback, and it'll be interesting to see if Vernon Adams is that guy.
Yeah, I mean, him and Lockie, it's going to be, if Adams can't be there, I don't know how confident I am with Lockie. I mean, that's no disrespect to that guy and, that individual, but, man, when you have a dynamic playmaker like Vernon Adams that is the possibility of coming in, I'll take him over Lockie every single day.
So staying in your wheelhouse a little bit and starting to get the discussion tracked on to Notre Dame, what do you make of this move for Everett Golson to FSU? When it first happened, it was, to me, kind of like a good riddance situation, but the more I watched some of those Notre Dame games last year, it wasn't as bad as I initially remembered it being.
Right. I think Everett's a really talented guy. And I think that he kind of got inside his own head in the second half of the season. They were deteriorating on defense, largely because of injuries, and some because, people found a weak spot in their defense, and that was having to play against tempo. They couldn't use all their packages that they like to use, and their base package wasn't very good on third down. So Everett had more and more thrown on his shoulders. If you look at the stats at the end of the year, there wasn't a big difference between Florida State and Notre Dame in terms of turnovers, in terms of defensive liabilities. But Florida State, Jameis Winston played at a higher level than Everett did. But, I think the only way that you would say good riddance, and I wouldn't use the word riddance, but I would say maybe blessing in disguise, is that if this quarterback competition had gone on much longer, I could see it becoming divisive. These guys weren't friends. They were cordial, and that's about it. And I think at some point the locker room would have started to take sides if there wasn't a clear-cut quarterback, which there wasn't in the spring. There always was last fall. But in the spring, they were very, very close. And so other than the standpoint that it leaves you exposed in terms of experience with your number 2 and number 3 quarterbacks, I think this was the best thing for Notre Dame.
I think when you look at Golston a lot, and I kind of want to take this with Brian Kelly too, because to me at times it looked like Everett Golston was a deer in the headlights. Was that, a direct impact of him missing a year and kind of taking a year off and kind of being in between? Or was it, Brian Kelly maybe not being a player's coach?
Well, I don't know if he's not a player's coach, but he maybe wasn't a good fit for Everett. And I think ultimately that's why Everett left. It wasn't, a lot of people said, well, Everett saw the handwriting on the wall. Malik was going to be the starter. I truly believe when the decision was made, Everett had the upper hand, that Everett hadn't lost that job yet. Malik was pressing, but Everett was still the guy, the leader in the clubhouse. And so I do think that it was the relationship between Brian and Everett, that maybe he didn't feel like Brian brought the best out in him, and that he also might have thought he would have a short leash as well. So, I think that you look at Everett in that Florida State game, and you just marvel at how poised he was in that game. And you look at the USC game, and it wasn't the same guy.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, he definitely looked like two different players, and that stands as one of my favorite games last year. It was action, 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 so close. Every turn that was taken was another exciting play and what's going to happen next, and that's what college football is really all about, that excitement and knowing that how quick both of these teams could get down the field if they want to. Just added a tremendous feeling around the game, and obviously everyone was gunning to knock Florida State out last year. It was, and we can all agree, I mean, they had so many teams come so very, 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 very close. It was almost like at some points that the Florida State was just playing above their head, and you knew it was just a matter of time, and Oregon, eventually did it. And I think it's going to be interesting to see how Golson is able to go to Florida State and handle that offense. And he's got still a lot of talent around him at that school that when you think Winston leaving knocks them down a peg, in comes Golson, and you have to just look at them and say, oh, there's still a possibility this team could fight for a spot in the playoffs.
Right. It's going to be interesting to see how he blends down there. And again, if the turnover bug becomes a problem or not for him. It wasn't just the interceptions. And again, sometimes Everett was trying too hard to make something happen as his defense was falling apart in November. But some of it was his problem was fumbles. He fumbled a lot. He wasn't real comfortable with, the zone read plays. I don't know that he'll have as much of that to do in Florida State's offense, which is a little bit more pro style than what Brian Kelly runs. So maybe, his running will be more, whatever it's comfortable with, which is kind of freelancing rather than called running plays. He just never found a comfort zone with the zone read stuff at Notre Dame, and it showed up in some really bad exchanges and some fumbles and a lot of lost fumbles.
It's interesting to me that Everett Golson went to an ACC school because Notre Dame has been linked to the ACC for a couple years now, and they've been included in all sports except for football. Do you think Notre Dame, A, needs a conference, or B, will ever get into a conference, and will that conference be the ACC?
Well, they're kind of in a contractual situation that if they do join a conference in the next decade or so, that it would have to be the ACC. They're contractually obligated that way. Do I think they will do that? Absolutely not. They've had a couple of referendums within their own ranks, dating back to around 1992, 93. And every time they come out, independent is best for them. Now, when there was a move from the BCS to this college football playoff, had there been a real impediment to Notre Dame getting into the playoff, then I think they would have really had to take a look at a situation of joining a conference. We always thought if the Big East imploded that could also push Notre Dame into a conference, but they were fortunate that there were several conferences that were willing to take them kind of with the arrangement they have now, playing an incomplete ACC schedule where, there is some benefit for that conference and yet they're not a full-time member. I think the Big 12 would have taken them with the same arrangement. I think that was a realistic option as well for Notre Dame. But the ACC was really where they wanted to be because they were concerned, when the Big East collapsed, they needed a place where their basketball teams, where their volleyball team, baseball team could play and prosper, and the ACC turned out to be it. So, again, unless there's a threat to those teams being in a conference or unless there's an impediment to getting to the ultimate prize, playing for a college football championship, I don't think that you'll see that. And we had a lot of that rhetoric thrown around by, maybe 9 or 10 coaches during the conference preview days. And about half of them were ACC coaches that thought Notre Dame should get into a conference, but they're not making the decisions about who gets into the playoff and who doesn't. And I really think before we get to the halfway point of this 12-year agreement for a 4-team college playoff, that you're going to get to either 6 or 8 teams, and then the difference of playing a conference championship versus not playing one becomes less pronounced.
Was there any talk of them joining the Big Ten? I mean, have they burned those bridges, or was there any talk of that?
Not in their latest referendum. Certainly, if we go back to the 90s, there was an open dialogue, and I think a lot of people thought, that, including Jim Delaney, the commissioner of the Big Ten, thought that there was a lot of momentum for Notre Dame joining the Big Ten. But ultimately, what pushed them away from the Big Ten was the thought that they would become a Midwestern school and not a national school. And they didn't want that. And so the Big Ten wasn't desirable from that standpoint. They feel like they have much more in common with the schools on the East Coast. So the ACC made a lot more sense for them. I think the Big 12 would have been a better fit in their mind than the Big Ten, simply because they keep that concept of being a national school and not a regional school.
I mean, I think for me, I always get a little bit of a chuckle when I hear the coaches from the ACC and maybe some of the other conferences come out and espouse their belief that, Notre Dame absolutely should have to join a conference in order to be considered. But when you look at it, first of all, Notre Dame is a storied program that can stand alone. And number two, they don't have any cupcakes on their schedule. If you look at their schedule top to bottom, I mean, they're going through multiple different conferences, playing a multitude of very difficult opponents. Their transcript would speak for itself, and I think it kind of, to me, it seems like they're almost a little bit worried with the reality that somebody from the ACC, the ACC champion, for example, could get jumped by a Notre Dame team just because of what their references would look like at the end of the year if they have strong performances against that schedule.
Yeah, I know that there was some probably the most vocal coaches when Notre Dame's basketball teams and a lot of their Olympic sports teams were in the Big East, were the Big East football coaches. There were coaches that said, why aren't they in here all the way? They didn't see the benefit, and obviously there was a benefit to Notre Dame being a part of their package, but I took kind of a look behind the numbers with some of this stuff, with what the coaches were saying, the 13 games versus the 12 games, and there's a couple things. One is, let's take the 8 years of the BCS, the last 8 years of the BCS, when everybody was playing 12 regular season games or more. That became the standard in 2006. So you theoretically would have had 32 playoff games those years. We'll use the BCS standings to get our 4 playoff teams. 16 out of those 32 played only 12 games. And you had at least one 12-game team in every one of those fields. And some of them were like Notre Dame in 2012, where they didn't have a championship game available to them. But some of them were teams that didn't win their division. Alabama, a national championship Alabama team fell into that category. There was a really good Oregon, a very good Stanford team. There were 7 out of those 16 played 12 games and didn't make it to their conference championship game. So I think that rings a little bit of hollow too. And then I looked at the ACC schedules for the last 8 years of the BCS and the first year of the playoff, the years that we've had 12 regular season games as a regular occurrence in college football. And Notre Dame's average schedule strength per the Sagarin ratings ended up averaging out at 28th. And the highest of the ACCs, which was Florida State's schedule, was 38th. So you could make an argument that by joining the ACC full time would actually hurt Notre Dame's strength of schedule rather than making them a more worthy playoff team.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I mean, it would, because you would play the the whole ACC instead of just picking and choosing, but it would
Right.
also hurt them financially, as we all know what college football is about, and it would also hurt their pocketbook. But I just want to talk about scheduling for a second.
Sure.
How difficult is it for Notre Dame to go out? I mean, because they can play anybody they want, whenever they want. So, I mean, is it difficult for them to go out and schedule a team, or do they have teams coming to them saying, hey, we want to play you?
They have teams lining up saying we want to play you, and so they can pick and choose, and they have some pretty cool series coming up. Now, where they're kind of hamstrung is that ACC agreement. It averages to be 5 teams a year. It's not always 5. Some years it's 4, some years it's 6, some years it's 5, but it averages out to be 5 a year. This is one of the years that it'll be 6. But let's just keep the number at 5. You've got 5 of them. And then you've got home and homes with Stanford, USC, and Navy. They're not going to lose those 3. So that gets you up to 8. Then you've got to come up with 2 games that are teams that are either willing to play you once at your place and no return trip, or a 2-for-1 like UMass and Temple. So that gets you up to 10 games, and you really only have flexibility then with the 2 other games on your schedule. And you want to make those good rivalries. You want to make those nationally attractive matchups, things that will help you get into the playoff. And certainly when they scheduled this Texas series, they thought Texas was going to be more formidable than they appeared to be going into this season. Now, maybe 2016 will be another story. They've scheduled Georgia. They've scheduled Ohio State. So there's some really good intersectional games in addition to these ACC and the staples that we've talked about.
The schedule is, just a great example of what Notre Dame football is all about to me, which is it's trying to be the best by beating the best. And in order to get into the playoffs, that's what they're going to have to do. So you're a little more experienced with this team than both Drew and I. I mean, we know a little bit about what's going on. You have undoubtedly a lot more firsthand knowledge. What do you think this team has to do in 2015 to get into the playoffs?
I do think, given who they're playing, they would have to go 12-0. I think the only way that they could go 11-1 is, let's say, USC or Clemson ended up being the number 1 team in the country, and they lost that game in overtime or kind of in a fluky fashion, and then Notre Dame continued to be strong after that point in the schedule. They play both of those teams in October, and if they continue to be impressive in November, and then Clemson and or USC continue to be dominant teams, then maybe you sneak in at 11-1.
Do you think they have a better opportunity than a Big 12 team if all records are consistent with one another?
I don't know. I mean, I think some years they will and some years they won't. You look at this year, there's so much anticipation that TCU and Baylor are going to be in that playoff mix. As you guys mentioned at the top of the show, TCU is kind of the consensus number 2 team in the country. And some of that comes from after they got shut out of the playoff, they drubbed a pretty good Ole Miss team in a bowl game. So that's kind of how they're looked upon going into that season. And if they went undefeated and Notre Dame went undefeated, I think the fact that they're starting at 2 and Notre Dame will probably start, in the AP poll anywhere from 8 to 12. I think they have an advantage, but there's some years where the advantage changes. I think Notre Dame's schedule this year is good. I don't think it's as challenging as it is some years. But we'll see how it plays out, because a lot of times teams fool you. You think this team is going to be incredible, and somebody like Georgia Tech comes rising up and is much better than everybody thought they would be.
I want to talk Brian Kelly real fast. What is the perception of him around this Notre Dame program? You've seen him on the sideline a lot, yelling at kids, in a day and age where, maybe that's not really looked upon too kindly. I mean, he's getting in kids' face. He's a fiery coach. We understand that. How is he perceived in the South Bend area? And is he maybe on the hot seat a little bit this year if they struggle?
Let me take the first part of that about the yelling part. I think people perceive him as a guy that has some similarities to Lou Holtz, because Lou Holtz would get in people's faces and would yell, and he was successful. And I think if you're successful, people say, okay, that's working. And if you're not successful, they say, well, that you need to change, you need to adjust. I think Brian is more cognizant of what he's doing when the cameras are watching than his early time at South Bend. That was Brian's MO at Cincinnati, at Central Michigan, at Grand Valley State, and I don't think he wants to drastically change from that. I think he's a guy that's willing to learn. He's pretty smart. He thinks on his feet well, but he's a fiery guy, and I think he thinks part of his success is being that fiery guy. And I think that players who come to play at Notre Dame know that that's what you're going to get. You know, early in my writing career, I covered Bob Knight at Indiana University with basketball. And those players knew exactly what they were getting when they walked in the door, even though, you know, when it's actually happening, it's probably a lot harsher than when you were watching it growing up and hearing about it. But you know what you're signing up for with Brian Kelly. In terms of being on the hot seat, I think this is a defining year for Brian Kelly. You know, a lot of people look at the 8-win seasons and go, and then some Notre Dame fans look at it and say, you know what, the last couple of guys that walked through the door after Lou Holtz, actually the last 3, didn't put those consistent 8-win seasons up. So this is an improvement. And certainly I think the 2012 run to the championship game buys him some equity. But I do think this is a defining season when you have 18 starters back. You've got a couple more starters back from 2013 who didn't play last year. So you could argue 20 starters back. You know, this is a year that they should at least go 10-2. This is a year that if they don't have a fluky run of injuries, you know, you need to be in a New Year's 6-day bowl. I wouldn't say it would be a hot seat, but I think people, and I think recruits too, would question, okay, where is this program going if Brian Kelly led this team to, let's say, 7 or 8 wins?
Well, Eric, we definitely appreciate your willingness to come on this podcast and talk Notre Dame football. Where can people find you and read up and listen to some of the other things you're doing?
Well, you can go to ndinsider.com. That's the South Bend Tribune's Notre Dame page. I'm on Twitter at ehansenndi, which I don't understand those letters, but that's what mine is. That's what I was told to be. We also have a football preview issue, and you can see that on our website. It's the ND Insider College Football Preview. We've got a lot of great stories in that. And then WSBT Radio, weekday sports beat is every day from 5 to 6 at WSBTradio.com.
All right, well, we definitely hope to have you down the stretch, and hopefully we'll be talking about a Notre Dame team that's fighting for a playoff spot.
Well, thanks for letting me do all the self-promo. I almost threw in that my grandson's selling candy for school.
What kind is it? I might want some.
They're really delicious candy bars.
Can you overnight them?
I think we can.
All right, well, you take care. Thanks again.
All right, thank you.
Bye. Well, Drew, that definitely takes us right into what we need to talk about next, and we're thankful for having all of our guests come on these shows. You know, it's one thing to hear from Drew and I, but then it's another thing to actually hear from people who know what they're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I thought that was a very interesting conversation. I'll say that.
So, you know, the independents are very exciting because we're essentially talking about 3 teams. We're talking about Army, we're talking about BYU, and we're talking about Notre Dame. And really, it's difficult to say that none of them. First of all, Notre Dame and BYU, if you look at their schedules, they have some of the toughest schedules in the country. There's literally no question about it. They both have very strong, with Notre Dame's being the strongest. It's not that Army doesn't, but they do have a few more games than the other ones where they're playing some lighter teams. What are your takeaways from these three teams? And ultimately, are we heading to a time in sports, in college football, where the necessity is going to be for there to be no independence?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Navy joined the conference recently. I respect everything that Army does, the Navy, all the, service academies I respect, and, applaud all those individuals for going to those schools. Because not only are you playing football, you're going out there, you're taking classes on how to drop a nuclear bomb or whatever it might be. I mean, you're doing stuff that normal people on an everyday college basis do not do. So all the respect and roll to these teams. But yeah, I do agree that you will see a time in the very near future that all three of these teams will be in a conference. And I think BYU is a team that would fit very well in a Pac-12, maybe even a Big 12. I really do feel that they would fit very nicely in both those conferences.
I'm in agreement with you on that. I think that that's ultimately the direction that things are going to need to go, is that it's, what happens if Notre Dame has a strong team, and let's be honest, man, they've got pieces. They've got a good quarterback, they've got a nice defense, they've got, they've got a great group of wideouts and running backs. I mean, I certainly wouldn't say that they're the best team on paper in college football, but
not even close.
But at the same time, is that what it's about? Does it matter who the best team on paper in college football is?
On paper, no. But
yeah,
as we know, those papers are published preseason, which then puts you in a position to be there at the end of the season. So if you're Notre Dame and you're ranked 10 to 15, whatever it might be, and you lose one game, you're done. But if you're a team ranked second, like TCU, and you lose a game, not the end of the world. So where you're put preseason, and it is all on paper, it's a big deal. I personally hate preseason polls, but I've said that before. If you're a team ranked in a lower top 25 and you lose a game, you drop out. And it literally, to get up to anywhere back in the top, near the top of the poll, is you have to struggle and claw, and it's no longer all in your hands.
I mean, before we go into the few teams we have to cover today, what would have happened to TCU if 2014 was 2015, right? They're coming into the season this year at 2. They came into the season last year at low 20s. Where were they at? Do you recall?
They were low 20s. I know that. I know some polls had them ranked, some polls didn't. I mean, they lost a lot from the previous year.
Right.
And nobody knew what this team was. So you bring in a team with Trayvon Boykin this year, and yeah, I do agree with you. What if?
Yeah, you hate, at this point especially, I think we're all sick and tired of playing what-if scenarios. That's all that we have done, literally, for, ever since the end of the college football season in 2014. But I think it's a fair illustration, because if they had been ranked number 2 at the beginning of last year, would that loss to Baylor have been dramatic, or would it have been a situation where, they beat up on so many teams throughout the year and their body of work was just so strong that one loss doesn't really knock them? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I know. I mean, I see what you're saying. I kind of hope that situation happens this year.
I think for no other reason that I like the variance that it causes,
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's get started. We're running out of time. Thankfully, we only have to go through 3 teams here. We'll start with Army, who in 2014 had the worst passing offense in the nation, the 6th ranked rushing offense, the 105th ranked overall offense. They had the 85th ranked passing defense, the 95th ranked rushing defense, and the 91st ranked overall defense. They scored 24.9 points and they allowed 32.9. 62.3 yards per game passing in this day and age of football. Is it sustainable?
Well, in their offense, yeah, they don't pass the ball. I mean, they refuse to pass the ball. It's a triple option. And they literally don't pass the ball. I don't even know if they work on passing in practice. I mean, to be very honest with you. I mean, they run the ball, and if that doesn't work, they're going to run the ball some more.
Yeah, I agree. And this is one of those things which really shows how much of a difference there is between college football and pro football, because pro football is now so heavily predicated on the pass to where you have to be passing the football to win, really. I mean, just look at how in the last, 10 years, the dynamic and the lifespan of the running back in the NFL has just decreased dramatically. So in college, it's just a completely different animal. This is really a tough team to analyze because they lost so much of what they had in terms of offense last year. They are returning A.J. Sure, who's going to be back for his senior year, but he's been unhealthy pretty much his entire stay at Army. So, to me, he's the guy that I'm looking to be the playmaker on this team. What do you see here?
I see a long season. Gone are the days where Army and Navy were playing for titles and having Heisman Trophy winners. That is a sad thing to say because, I look at those old black and white footages. I read the stories from back in the day when they were competing for titles and they had these great players. And, those days are long gone, as I said. So this team they are what they are. They're Army. You go out, you respect them. You're never going to see a kid from Army, have discipline issues, all this stuff. So, again, there's not much more to say than Army is Army. We respect the heck out of you guys, but football-wise, you are what you are.
That's a really good way of putting it. I mean,
thanks.
They're going to have some exciting games and exciting moments, and there will be a few times throughout the year where somebody on the team has a really nice stat line and some good highlight plays to show from it. But Army just isn't a team at this point where you're like tuning in to see what happens next.
I mean, the only time you do that is for Army Navy, and that's a spectacle in itself. And again, it is what it is, and you hate to say that, but it is.
Team number 2 would be BYU, who in 2014 had the 27th ranked passing offense, the 49th ranked rushing offense, the 28th ranked overall offense. They had the 114th ranked passing defense, the 20th ranked rushing defense, and the 58th ranked overall defense. They scored 37.1 points and they allowed 27.5. And I think from my perspective, the excitement here is that after his season being ended after 4 or 5 games last year, Taysom Hill, from everything that I've seen written about him in fall camp thus far, looks very strong.
Yeah, he is the spark plug of this offense, if you will. He is the guy that makes everything go. He runs, he passes. He's similar kind of to Tim Tebow in the aspect of, he's a bigger guy that can run you over, that can run through you, and they can run away from you if you need to. And he's got a good arm, and he's pretty accurate. So I'm excited for this offense. Defense, I have serious issues, but offense-wise, I think they should compete in a lot of these games because if you look at their schedule, they don't play a lot of hard teams. They play a lot of teams from the AAC and teams of that nature. So this team has potential to win 8, 9, even 10 games if Taysom Hill stays healthy.
They can. The early part of the schedule is probably the most difficult because they're playing Nebraska, Boise State, UCLA, and Michigan. The first,
I could see him winning 2 games, a third one being a toss-up.
Right, and they end up playing Missouri near the end of the year. I mean, they have a well-diversified schedule, which is fun to see the variance against the different conferences. My main concern, which when I did my research wasn't a concern because it didn't come out until after, but running back Jamal Williams, who got injured the same game as Taysom Hill and was out for the remainder of the season. I think he came back for a half a game and then re-aggravated the injury.
Yes.
He is not going to be playing in 2015.
He gone.
Which he's supposed to come back in 2016. It wasn't a health thing. I'm not sure what
it was disciplinary.
Was it disciplinary? Okay.
Yeah.
So that leaves, and when he went down, Paul Lasike was the guy who stepped in and did an admirable job. He's gone. So you're really starting to run into a situation where your depth is taking a major hit, and you've got Algeron Brown and Adam Hine. I'm not confident that they're going to be able to make up for the loss in production in Williams and Lasike. But I could be surprised because I don't think people thought Lasike was going to be able to come in and take over for Williams, and he did fine. Is Taysom Hill going to be healthy enough to kind of pick up the extra burden? He's got Mitchell Juergens, Mitch Matthews on the outside. I think they've got some good work there. I believe Taron Hoke is back as well. So he's got some targets, but just hoping that knee injury didn't take the mobility out of him. And certainly he's young enough that he should be able to bounce back from this injury.
Yeah, if he's healthy, I mean, this is one of the best all-around quarterbacks in the nation. He can, like I said, he can run, he can pass, he can do everything. So, again, if he can stay healthy, this offense should be just fine. The defense, like I said, has major issues, major holes. Some of the guys they have returning are suspended, yada, yada. A lot of issues on defense, a lot of issues.
I agree. I think they're going to be one of the more exciting teams to watch, if for no other reason than Taysom Hill, because he's that dynamic of a player. But ultimately, I don't think they're just not in a position. They're the team that's independent that could certainly benefit from joining a conference.
Yeah, I mean, where do you think would be a good fit for them? Would it be the Big 12, Pac-12, or do you think they should maybe go to the Mountain West, back to the Mountain West?
I'd say either the Mountain West or the Big 12, with no disrespect to either of those conferences, but I think the Pac-12 has they've kind of taken a step up in competition, and I think BYU would be a little out of the league there. Do you disagree with that?
No, not at all. I just, it's an interesting discussion. You have a team like BYU, I feel like they would fit a lot of different places.
They would, and go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, have you read or has anything been said about the suspensions from the brawl in their bowl game?
No, and that's interesting. I don't know.
Yeah, that's why. I was trying to do some research on it, and I don't know if a lot of those guys were just seniors that were suspended, quote unquote, or what happened there, because it's been kind of quiet, unless I'm just not looking in the right spots, but.
Yeah, I think that's some good follow-up research to do, but if not, hopefully we hear before the start of the season, because there's nothing more frustrating than if you're playing fantasy and you're making assumptions that don't turn out to be true. I think this guy has a great matchup. I'm going to play him only to find out, oh, yeah, remember when he got in that fight, we decided, at 11 a.m. this morning that we were suspending him.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I hope they don't drag this out to the season, and you're, maybe you're starting center or whatever it might be. You know what I mean? I hope it has been said, and I just can't find it because I'm literally been looking the basketball days. I can't find anything on the suspensions.
Almost the best way to kind of judge that would be to see how the Vegas lines move, if they move, the first week of the season, because they play Nebraska, so we're not talking about a throwaway game. They're not playing, the FCS like a lot of teams are. They're not playing dramatic out-of-conference games against lower opponents. They're playing, what I think would be a step above or equal to where they're at in terms of talent. At least offensively, defensively might be a different story. But
it should be a fun game though too.
It should be a fun game, but the last thing you want to do is see, like you said, a starting center. That changes the whole play calling. What you have to do if you're gonna have a less experienced center with potentially less talent as well. Getting the ball to the quarterback, you could also lose in pass protection. You could lose in run coverage. Holes might not open up. So it really changes how you have to game plan altogether.
Yeah, and I'm literally just reading it as we're talking about this right now. As of March 3rd of 2015, so that was early in the year, but still, there still had been no final decision on suspensions. And Bronco Mendenhall has said in this conference that day that up to 10 players could be suspended. So if nothing's been said yet, and again, if anybody's out there that knows anything about these suspension, please tweet us at CFB Pros Drew, at CFB Pros. Find us on Facebook, College Football Pros. Please let us know, because we honestly can't find anything.
Yeah, I mean, that's valid, and hopefully they don't wait much longer, but I want to take a little sidetrack and I want to poll you, all right? Should Bronco Mendenhall be a wrestling name?
Yes, absolutely.
Every time I hear that, I think of that's a good wrestling name, Bronco Mendenhall.
That would be good with the lights going out and like the Bronco, the neigh from the horse and everything. It'd be cool.
Yeah.
Like
Anyway, I had to work that in there. We
always got to go wrestling.
45 minutes without professional wrestling. I mean, what else would we be doing if we weren't talking wrestling?
Probably talking college football.
Anyway, we'll finish up where we started with Notre Dame. They had the 19th ranked passing offense, the 70th ranked rushing offense, the 94th ranked overall offense, the 77th ranked passing defense, the 74th ranked rushing defense, the 73rd overall defense, the 32.8 points scored per game. Sorry, I'm getting tongue-tied. 29.2 points allowed. Changes behind center where Zaire's definitely going to get the chance. Greg Bryant was recently deemed ineligible to play, so they have to deal with finding a backup running back. They lose their starting tight end, but they never seem to really have a tough time finding a good tight end. We talked a lot already about this. One interesting note is I've seen that wide receiver C.J. Prosise has been used in the backfield a lot, so he's a good, interesting guy to keep an eye on because with Bryant getting ruled ineligible and having an abundance of wide receivers, he could really be looked at as a guy who could be like an athlete position and just be used all over the field.
Yeah, Brian Kelly will definitely find a way to get the ball in his hand, but I want to go back on something you said when we were talking a lot earlier in the beginning of this podcast about Notre Dame's schedule, and you said it was good. I want to take serious exception to that because this schedule for an independent is laughable. Are you kidding me? How do you say that they're playing the best of the best out here when you're playing UMass, Navy, Temple, Pitt, Wake Forest, Boston College, Stanford, who we're high on, but still isn't a top-level team? I want you to defend yourself in this situation. How will you say that?
I'll absolutely defend myself. So you named matchups that you think are inferior. Okay. Number one, Massachusetts has a very strong offense. Notre Dame's defense is questionable. That puts them in a position where that's going to be a close game.
What do you think Ohio State would do to UMass?
It'd be a slaughter.
Okay. I don't. That's fine. Just go ahead. What else?
Then Georgia Tech, who they played before Massachusetts, and Georgia Tech showed what they were capable of last year in returning the quarterback and a lot of their skill players and in an offensive scheme that they definitely have down is going to make for a tough game. They play Clemson, who could potentially win. Clemson is one of like 5 teams. No, I think Clemson is one of 2 teams in the last 5 years that has won 10 games a year. Clemson. Okay. So that's a tough ball. That team could be a top 4 team at the end of the year. They're returning a lot. Their defense is ridiculous, and they're bringing Watson back. They've got Mike Williams. The other wide receiver, unfortunately, escapes me right now, but they've got an abundance of talent. So there's a strong team right there. Navy is what it is, but they're competitive at least. USC, we've talked about them potentially being in the playoff scenario. Pitt is a team that a lot of people are very high on. I'm kind of maybe not there with that, but still I think they're highly competitive. Boston College usually yields a pretty decent defense, and they'll find a way to move the ball on offense. And finally, Stanford, another team we talked about. So you're dealing with a situation where potentially 3 teams on their schedule have a legitimate shot at making the college football playoffs. And let's not forget, like Eric mentioned, when they scheduled Texas, they didn't think Texas would be the Texas that it is in 2014. They thought it was going to be a better Texas team. Nothing you can really do about there. I agree that Wake Forest, Temple, Virginia, and then ultimately the Texas game look bad on paper, but what schools have 3 potential teams that could possibly end up in the playoff scenario that are legitimate, that don't play an FCS opponent, that what they have one game that's not the Big 12, the ACC, or the Pac-12. They have one game against the MAC. So they have one game that are
Temple, Navy, and UMass are not in any of those conferences.
Oh, well, okay. Temple is in what, the AAC?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm just saying,
I mean, my point is that you go out, you're supposed to be Notre Dame. You're supposed to have teams banging on your door and break it down. You want to be a team that is the Notre Dame that it was in the 90s, in the late 80s, back from Eric Hansen's day. Go play somebody. Are you kidding me right now? You tell me right now that USC, and I'll give you Texas, because years ago when the schedule was made, which I also think is wrong, they shouldn't make schedules 25 years in advance, but that's for another day. You play two teams that are legit. You go to any other conference. You go to a conference. You go to a Power 5 conference. You're playing those two teams in conference. Then you could go out and schedule somebody else tougher to prove that you're a team deserving of a Final Four spot. If this team goes undefeated with this schedule and Texas is who we think they are, and God forbid USC slips up, they can still go undefeated and still be ranked 10th.
I don't think
if Ohio State, take a team from the Big 12, doesn't matter, TCU, Alabama, and Auburn, if they're all one-loss teams or undefeated, if this Notre Dame team is undefeated with this schedule, they're getting left out. There's not even a question they're getting left out.
But I'm saying you're just like I am. You're one of the ones that sit at the altar of the potential TCU and Baylor, SMU, Lamar, Rice, Texas Tech, Kansas. Have I frightened you at all yet? Have I said anything that already I've listed?
But they're in a conference. You're making my argument for me. They're in a conference.
That is not an argument. They're in a conference where they're eons above the other teams.
So if you're Notre Dame,
it's not really a defense in your argument.
It completely is, because so if you're Notre Dame, go out there and schedule 2 or 3 really good teams right now.
They have Stanford, USC.
Oh my
Clemson.
God, Stanford is going to win maybe 7 games in the Pac-12. Well, I know we're both high on Stanford, but come on, man. Realistically, no, they're not a tough team. Texas, USC. I'll give you Texas because, like we said, Texas was supposed to be
Texas. I'm just saying they're playing Georgia Tech, Clemson, USC, Pitt, Stanford. Those are quality games. I mean, you're just because the Big 12 is a conference. If Big 12 is a conference, what do they have to man up for? There's
join a conference. They don't want to join a conference because of the big time money that NBC is giving them. Let's be very, very honest. They will never win a conference.
Good. That's smart business.
That's horrible business when you're getting left out of the playoff because you can't play anybody.
But like you said, they've got games scheduled in the coming years against the likes of Ohio State. What happens if that Ohio State team somehow loses ground in recruiting, or it just has maybe Urban messes up for the first time in his storied career and they weren't who they thought they were? And you're sitting here 4 years from now arguing with me that this Ohio State team is garbage. Like, that's where this Texas team was back then.
I told you I'll give you Texas. I said that's a legit game because when you schedule it, you don't, just like Ohio State did last year with Virginia Tech and this year with Virginia Tech. You didn't think Virginia Tech was going to be on the outside looking into the top 25 5 years ago when the game was scheduled. When you come in the last year, you're like, crap, Virginia Tech isn't even ranked. Who booked this game? Well, it happens because the schedules are made so far in advance. I'm not holding that against Notre Dame because Texas was supposed to be good and they should have been better.
Yeah, that's definitely from my perspective, one thing that I'm not going to necessarily agree on. I think that, and you're going to get mad at me for saying it, but the reality is the SEC ends up having the toughest schedules. I'm not saying they're the toughest teams, but they end up with the toughest schedules.
Because everybody's so overrated and overinflated before the season.
That's why these guys are already fighting to try to get 8 teams, because they're like, our teams are they're close, they're toss-up games because it's tough, gritty, et cetera, whatever they want to say. Like, they're not wrong. It's just frustrating to hear the obvious bias. That's why people get upset with the SEC. It's not necessarily a true belief that they believe that there's a bunch of conferences that are better. It's just that you don't want a media source where you're supposed to get, prejudice-free information from journalistic integrity, you don't want to hear them drooling over one conference. It makes you feel like what you're seeing is already, it's like you're watching professional wrestling, with all due respect to it.
I think Notre Dame should be on that bandwagon with the SEC to put it to 8 teams, because I haven't looked at their schedules in the future. To be honest with you, I have not looked at them. But if their schedules in the future or anything like this, they're going to need 8 teams.
Well, I'm just saying, by the same measure, with no conference championship game, that TCU and Baylor should get left out. And
they will.
But they won't.
Will.
There's so much of a push. You watch, if TCU ends up slipping up, as long as somehow there aren't 3 other undefeated teams, TCU is going to make it, or Baylor's going to make it. The media is not going to let the Big 12 2 years in a row swim when everyone else is on dry land playing football, unless both teams lose. I'm just telling you.
The worst thing that could happen for the Big 12 in that situation is if Baylor loses early, gets upset by somebody, and then Baylor beats TCU towards the end.
Which is exactly what happened last year.
That's what I'm saying. So that's the worst case scenario in that situation. They're getting left out. I don't care where they're ranked.
Yeah, I'm of the opinion that I think that, there's a lot that needs to be done, and we'll cover it. We talked about it before, with the Power 5 and the non-Power 5, the Group of 5. Maybe something needs to be done to ensure that there's a little more evenness, so that there's a better baseline for judgment. You don't want to leave it up to people. People are going to be inherently biased for one reason or another. If you have everybody being judged along the same basic line, it leaves less room for, that personal touch, which is not what is needed.
And this is why these teams need to schedule better. And
Absolutely.
they are. And they are making that push to not schedule FCS opponents, and they're scheduling these big-time Power 5 programs more and more. And I agree with that wholeheartedly, as I've said in the past.
Well, it's been fun, Drew. It's been great arguing about the benefits of having a more well-rounded system in place, so that things could be done on a more consistent level. Where can you be found by people who want to argue with you about the things that I've already proven you were incorrect about?
You can always argue with me, and I will always tell you how wrong your opinion is at CFB Pros Drew. And if they want to just come talk to you about butterflies and flowers, because that's apparently all you want to talk about, where can we find you?
Well, I'm charging them if they want to talk about butterflies and whatever the other thing you said, flowers, because I don't know anything about that, okay? I'm not a botanist. I don't know that stuff. I'm an indoor
But you know what
guy.
a botanist is.
It's just the first word that came to mind, all right? I'm thinking fast. I'm talking fast. I'm on a few hours of sleep. I'm going to order candy from, South Bend to be delivered overnight, because now Eric Hansen has me wanting candy bars. But you can find me at CFB Pros on Twitter, College Football Pros on Facebook, www.cfbpros.com on the internet. Join us again next week when we're talking about the Mountain West.